What's the most terrifying thing you can imagine happening in your own home? For some, it might be a home invasion or an earthquake that levels your house. But to residents of 1980s England, their greatest fear was being bludgeoned to death while sleeping with a baseball bat by a mysterious assailant. This nightmare became a horrific reality for several families living on a quiet suburban street. So what happened on Elm Street, and who was responsible for the terrifying crime spree? In the early 1980s, the residents of a quiet London suburb had absolutely no idea that their idyllic neighborhood would soon become known as a terrifying murder scene. In fact, the residents of 13, 15, and 17 Elm Street were so unassuming that they didn't even bother to lock their front doors at night. That all changed, however, when a series of brutal murders shook the once peaceful community to its core. In February 1988, a resident of 13 Elm Street was awoken in the middle of the night by what sounded like screams in the street. Although she couldn't identify the source of the commotion at the time, she would later tell police that the noise had come from a man's voice. When she looked out her front window, she saw a dark figure fleeing down the street. Little did she know that she had just witnessed the murder of her neighbor, 66-year-old William Seeley, who was discovered bludgeoned to death in his home just hours later. It wasn't long before another Elm Street resident also became the victim of a brutal nighttime attack. On March 2nd, 1988, 53-year-old Noelle Reed was found lifeless in her home, having been struck over the head with a heavy blunt object. Just 2 weeks later, on March 19th, 1988, another woman, 48-year-old Shirley Ashdown, was discovered dead in her home from a severe head injury. Although the 3 women were all killed in the same manner, the police were baffled because there were no signs of forced entry in any of the homes and nothing had been stolen. It was almost as if the killer had simply strolled into the victims' houses through their unlocked front doors in the middle of the night and attacked them in their beds. As the police continued their investigation into the seemingly random crimes, they would soon uncover a horrifying pattern. All 3 victims had been attacked between 1 a.m. and 4 a.m., and each had been hit on the head with a weapon that was never found. Even more disturbing was the fact that none of the victims had any apparent connection to one another, leading investigators to believe that the killer may have been targeting elderly women in the area. However, the killer would soon strike again, this time targeting a much younger victim. On April 2nd, 1988, 17-year-old Sarah Jane Baker was found dead in her bed, having been bludgeoned to death. What made this case particularly gruesome was the fact that Sarah's mother, Yvonne, who was also in the house at the time of the murder, had been viciously attacked but miraculously survived. When the police arrived at the scene, they discovered that the killer had not only smashed in Sarah's skull, but had also attempted to decapitate her. Although Yvonne suffered severe head injuries, she was rushed to the hospital, where she was able to tell police that a man wearing a black leather jacket and a black hat had entered the house through the front door, attacked her and her daughter with a baseball bat, and then fled. With a motive now established, the police were able to narrow down their search to a potential list of suspects. However, despite having multiple witnesses, the killer would remain at large for years. The case went cold, and the residents of Elm Street eventually began to feel that justice for the victims was never going to be served. But the truth would eventually catch up with the killer. After gathering all of the evidence in the case, the police were able to establish that all 5 victims had been killed in virtually the same way, making it one of the most horrific killing sprees in British history. But who was behind the brutal crimes? Although the police were never able to definitively say what motivated Anthony to go on a killing spree, the case was eventually solved thanks to a single crucial piece of evidence: a baseball cap found near the scene of one of the murders. Although the cap didn't contain any DNA evidence, the police were able to trace it back to its owner, leading them directly to Anthony. Want to dive into the chilling crimes that rocked London back in the 80s? You've got to check out the awesome resources we've got lined up for you. And hey, if you're hungry for even more spine-tingling crime tales, just stick around. Trust me, you won't want to miss it.